Hello, we're rolling into another episode of the DRH show. As usual, I talk to interesting people within psychology, mental health, and well-being. Today, I'm joined by one of the leading experts in conspiracy theories, Dr. Daniel Jolley. Thanks for joining me.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here, Dr. Jolley. So let's start off with you telling us your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing. It's rather unusual what you're doing. I've never come across with a lot of psychologists investigating conspiracy theories, so it'll be lovely to hear your story.
So I've been looking into the psychology of conspiracy theories. So why people believe and what their consequences of believing could be for about 10 years. So I became interested in this area during my undergraduate thesis when I was a student. I was thinking about what do I find interesting and what do I want to understand. So this is back in 2010, where there was no literature on the psychology of conspiracy theories. So it was very much just me thinking about the things that I find interesting. So why do so many people believe that Diana was murdered by the government, or she was killed by the royal family? I was really intrigued to learn about why people believe in this stuff. So I did my undergraduate thesis looking into paranoia and conspiracy beliefs, and I quite liked the academic side, as in I enjoyed the research, I enjoyed asking a question that was my own. So I decided to do a master's, and I moved to the University of Kent, where I started working with Kara Douglas. And I did my master's thesis looking into conspiracy theories. I then stayed to do my PhD. I have been academic now 4 or so years, where I was a postdoc, moving to being a lecturer, a senior lecturer, and then I'm currently at SL based at Northumberland University in Newcastle in the UK, where my research interests still broadly sit around conspiracy narratives. I do dabble in other kind of interesting topics. Obviously, fake news, misinformation is something that's very relevant, but I'm still really fascinated to learn more about the consequences and interventions. And in during that 10 years or so, there has been a whole range of different scholars become interested in this area. It's not just psychologists, it's historians, it's sociologists, philosophers, political scientists, all interested in understanding conspiracy narratives, all from slightly different angles. We, as psychologists, want to know why people believe. The historians are more interested in the theories themselves. So how did a certain theory change over time? How did it first arise? The political scientists, of course, are more interested in the political aspects. So how conspiracy narratives can play out in politics. Of course, with Trump, it's brought conspiracy theories to the forefront. But I think the key thing is that conspiracy theories can be seen from a whole range of different angles. It's not just psychologists. And indeed, I'm part of a good network that brings together all these scholars across the world, where we can learn from each other. And being a part of this network has enabled me to think about conspiracy theories in a different way. And of course, also showcase to historians and philosophers how we do our kind of investigations and how we understand conspiracy theories too. And so my background is very much in this field, where I started off as a student and I moved up to being an academic, where I kind of publish and talk about conspiracy theories a lot. And of course, when I'm recording this is during the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of my work pre-COVID was based on anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. So I've talked a lot about conspiracy theories to the media, which is good. I like public engagement, so it's fun.
And this is also a form of public engagement.
Well, absolutely. Doing an interview with a video, it's not kind of necessarily your usual 9 to 5, but I quite like that side of being an academic.
So, Dr. Jolley, you already briefly alluded to what you mean by conspiracy theory, but I suppose for the benefit of us who are not familiar with conspiracy theory, something that we always hear, but we're not really familiar what is conspiracy theory. So right off the bat, as an academic, as a lecturer, could you could you explain to us what exactly is a conspiracy theory? Because some people would argue that what might be a conspiracy theory for you may be really factual and truth to me. So how do you balance that definition?
Well, I think defining a conspiracy theory is quite challenging. And as I mentioned, that there's a whole range of different scholars who are interested in this field. And we all slightly have a different take on how you define a conspiracy. And there's been many debates on how to define it. But I see the kind of key ingredients as there being a perceived powerful group that is acting in secret to cover up something for their own self-interest. So it's explaining a significant event as the secret actions of perceived powerful groups rather than overt activities. Now, these groups could be a whole range of different things. It could be the government, it could be the drugs companies, but it also could be different minority group status. So there's a whole range of conspiracy theories to do with Jewish people and immigrants. So it's not just about the government, it can be about a range of different things. But the key thing is that they're perceived to be powerful and they're acting in secret. And what you find is almost every significant event has a conspiracy associated. But it's never just one conspiracy or one conspirator. There's usually a range of conspiracies and a range of conspirators. So thinking of Diana, what I mentioned right at the start, some believe she was murdered by the royal family, others believe she was murdered by the government. Two very different conspirators. When we think about climate change, some believe it's a governmental side or the oil companies, or it can be endless. So the key thing is it's powerful groups acting in secret.
And earlier you alluded to fake news. Would you say fake news is an example of conspiracy theory, or is just another, and just another aspect of misinformation?
I think it's another aspect. So fake news, misinformation, it's where something is fake. And it's misinformation, it's not intentionally fake. It's just false information that is being spread. Disinformation is where someone has intent behind it. So they're making this fake on purpose and they're spreading it on purpose. But it doesn't need to be conspiratorial or in nature. It could just be fake information. Of course, fake news, misinformation, disinformation is a flourishing ground for conspiracy narratives, whereby suggesting that the government is involved in COVID-19, for example, where it's a bioweapon, is a conspiracy theory, which means that it can be mixed up with things that are just not true. But it's that element of, going back to that definition, it's that element of having a secret group who is conspiring. Whereas suggesting a crazy, cure for COVID-19 could just be misinformation or disinformation. Whereas suggesting it's a cure because of a government conspiracy, well, then that's where the line between a conspiracy narrative and fake news can come together. But I see them as very different things that do work together, but can be very separate at the same time.
And of course, it's quite relevant to ask you this question. Let's talk about coronavirus. And of course, a lot of people have different opinions about coronavirus. It's not really like 50-50, but I would rather describe it as like 80-20. Like most of the people in this country would say that, lockdown is really the necessary measure to contain the virus. But I have to be honest with you. I'm one of those people who are not really in favor of the lockdown. So would you classify that as fake news or as conspiracy theory, or what would you classify such belief?
I think it depends on the motive. So if
I think I would have to clarify. I'm sorry to interrupt. I think I would have to clarify my stance then. I think my belief that lockdown is rather disproportionate measure. It comes from the idea that, because I'm originally from the Philippines and I've seen this before. I've seen SARS before, the SARS virus in Asia. And I was already in my 20s when that happened. And we did not impose a lockdown, and we happened to be able to contain the virus. We survived. So I don't really see, despite my lack of like epidemiological background, I don't really see coronavirus as any different. So would you, going back to my original question, would you
Mm.
classify that as, fake news, or is probably an offshoot of the fake news, or is
Yeah.
it more of, shall we say, conspiracy theory?
I would suggest not conspiracy theorizing, because the key thing that you've missed out is that there's some hidden motive where the government has made COVID-19, or there's some kind of collusion with the vaccine, or
Mm-hmm.
something secret is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Suggesting it's just a different approach to deal with different types of viruses may just be down to the information that you're being given and your thought processes around that.
Mm-hmm.
But that would be seen more as the misinformation side. Whereas if you would have talked about, I think it's been covered up, I think the government's trying to do this to have some kind of secret motive, to try and manufacture a vaccine for us that will then control the population, which are indeed some conspiracy theories, that would be conspiracy narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there are some suggestions that 5G is also involved with COVID-19, whereby 5G somehow has caused COVID-19 and or is aiding its spread. Again, believing in those types of narratives would be seen as conspiratorial, because it's suggesting that there's some hidden group of people doing this on purpose, and COVID-19 is in essence manufactured.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the kind of conspiratorial narrative. But what we do know, and from previous work and work that has been recently published, is that people who believe in conspiracy theories, so that there's some plot to do with the virus, are more likely not to follow advice. So because they don't trust the government, they're less likely to want to use vaccination or to use antibiotics. And instead, they would favour alternatives, things that are pushed by the underdog, i.e. people who are similar to them, who they trust, which I do think in that mindset makes sense. That if you don't trust the government, you're going to look to others to who you do trust. It's just unfortunate that those who you look to are suggesting alternatives that at best may be ineffective and at worst may actually be lethal. And indeed, that has been shown with COVID-19. A paper last week was accepted that in a French sample, which demonstrated that when behaviours were supported by the government, people who engaged in conspiracy narratives pushed back on them. Whereas behaviours that were not supported by the government, as in the government didn't mention them, there was no kind of normative context around it, those who believed in conspiracy theories were happy to support it. So it really highlights that the source matters. When something is seen to be government driven, people who believe in conspiracy narratives are less likely to engage, which has been shown before, and as I say, has been shown in the COVID-19 era. And that's a study that's in France, but also I've seen studies in the UK where a similar pattern has emerged. Those who believe in conspiracy theories are less supportive of complying with compliance, because they just don't trust the government to act in a trustworthy way. So they rather follow the alternatives, which, as I say, can be really dangerous.
And based from your experience, what would you say is the greatest conspiracy theory?
I suppose it's going back to what we see as the greatest. So great, I could see as what's believed in the most. And the idea that JFK was assassinated is regularly believed by around 60% of the American public. So millions, literally millions of people subscribe to these viewpoints. And indeed, that kind of percentage has been shown in other types of conspiracy theories. So in the UK, a year or so ago, it was highlighted that 60% of British people believe in a conspiracy, at least one. There's been some polls with COVID-19 highlighting that up to 40% of people believe in some type of conspiracy with COVID-19. So these are millions and millions of people believing. So in one hand, that could be seen as a great conspiracy because they're so widely endorsed. Well, it could also be the greatest impact, maybe. So believing in anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, believing that climate change is a hoax, could have really big impacts. So we know that people who believe that vaccines are not safe, that it's been covered up for profit, are less likely to vaccinate. Similarly, those who believe climate change is a hoax, it's being made up by the world scientists, are less likely to reduce the carbon footprint. So similarly, you could argue, well, these conspiracy theories could have a really great impact. And there are other kind of weird and wacky conspiracies. Some of my favourite ones, where I asked some young people, what conspiracy theories do they know of? And someone highlighted that they believe Beyonce is a robot. Those are kind of more weird and wacky that have less of a consequence associated. Believing that Beyonce is a robot will have limited impact potentially on society, whereas believing that climate change is a hoax is going to impact both me and also you. So the greatest can be seen in different ways, popularity, but also the impact. I think.
And as a researcher, could you describe to us how conspiracy theory work? Basically, what I'm saying is that why is it that, you know, seemingly absurd notions like Beyonce being a robot, why does it appeal to other people, and where does it all start from?
Well, that Beyonce one is a weird and wacky one, and I've definitely not seen anyone actually really truly believe in it. But in essence, conspiracy theories often arise in moments of crisis in society. When we are feeling anxious, uncertain, when we are trying to make sense of a chaotic world. It could be a rapid political change. It could be a terrorist attack. It could be a virus outbreak, where we are just trying to make sense of what has happened. And by blaming a set of conspirators for what has happened can make at least you temporarily feel more in control. Oh, the reason that COVID-19 is occurring is because of a government conspiracy. It's all a bioweapon. It kind of makes sense. It's a simple explanation for a very complex problem. If you think about COVID-19 and what we do know is very anxiety provoking, but holding on to a conspiracy offers something tangible. Like believing that 5G is the cause of COVID-19, not only does it offer a scapegoat, while it's 5G, it also offers a way to stop it. If we burn down those towers, COVID-19 will stop. So conspiracy theories, in a way, are just us trying to engage in a sense processing. But there are different quirks that make us more drawn to conspiracy narratives. So it could be to do with our personality. It could be to do with some biases. So we often assume that big events are explained by something equally as big. So the death of a princess or a terrorist attack must be explained by a large cause. Believing that COVID-19 is a simple thing from animals doesn't maintain personality. To explain COVID-19 as a worldwide phenomenon as some kind of government conspiracy maintains that proportionality. So in the moment where we're feeling anxious, uncertain, our brain may tick in and make us be more drawn to this conspiracy narrative because, as I say, it offers a simple solution for a very complex problem.
And based from your research, have you also found if there is a link between conspiracy theory and personality types? And basically what I'm asking is that why is it that some people seem to be drawn more to, conspiracy theory, and whereas some people seem to be more critical of the information they receive?
So there are some personality quirks, such as being a narcissist, so having a very positive image of yourself and your group, you're more drawn to conspiracy theories. Also, if you have the need to feel unique, you're also more likely to engage in conspiracy theorizing. In essence, it's going back to that intergroup process, whereby it's us versus them. And by believing in conspiracy theories about the other group, about Democrats, about Republicans, for example, you are more likely to be able to feel higher self-esteem because I'm different to them. And it can explain things happening in the world by that. If I lose an election, it's because the other party conspired. They were involved in voter fraud, for example. But then what you find is, of course, the other group then engaged in the same thought processes. So the Republicans about the Democrats and the Democrats about the Republicans, which means that it's that kind of in-group and out-group bias, which can be kind of fueled by being a narcissist, where you really want to see your group as the best thing ever. So by believing in conspiracy theories about the other group, it can help with that process. So there are some personality variables that do play a role, but I think it's a mixture of the environmental cues, your personality, and also the biases that we have in our mind. So the proportionality bias, for example. But we also know that those people who have different skill sets, so those who can think more critically, are less likely to believe in conspiracy theories. Often because they're able to think through evidence. That when they're exposed to conspiracy narratives online, they can think through that evidence and not necessarily be bamboozled by that conspiracy theory. So I think it's a mixture of those factors together, and that there's not necessarily one profile of a conspiracy theorist. I think it's very dependent on these factors interacting, to be honest.
And you mentioned something about online earlier, so I'm just interested. Would you say that because of the internet, conspiracy theories has been magnified, or it's easy to manufacture conspiracy theory because of the internet?
Good. The internet's a really interesting one. So it is worth noting that conspiracy theories have existed since, well, the start of time. They have been talked about and popularized without the internet. The example that I mentioned earlier about JFK came into popularity without the internet. So conspiracy theories can exist in a world where we do not have the internet. So then the question then arises is, has the internet made conspiracy theories even more popular than they were? At least currently, there's no hard data that suggests they have. Because people often stay in their echo chambers, because confirmation bias kicks in, whereby your prior beliefs kind of govern how you see information. So things that support my viewpoint, I endorse and I'm likely to share and engage in. Things that go against it, I'm likely to discredit it. And this happens in all elements of our life, but also happens in conspiracy theorizing. So people who maybe see the world as full of conspiracies, or who maybe have been starting to be exposed to conspiracy narratives, may start to engage in this kind of worldview that they see the world as full of conspiracies. So they start just talking to people who are similar to them. They, in essence, join an echo chamber where they stay in the same circles, which means that conspiracy theories are as popular potentially now as they were without the internet, because people are still staying in these chambers. But with that said, the internet is more accessible than ever. When an event occurs, we're able to talk about it immediately. Things that were once maybe on the fringes can come into the mainstream very quickly. So people could be exposed to conspiracy narratives more than ever. And maybe it's quicker in that regard. So someone could have heard about a COVID-19 conspiracy theory, but because of the internet, they've heard about it quicker. And maybe the volume of the tweets are also more significant. So in that regard, by thinking about it like that, well, maybe potentially for some people, it increases their conspiracy beliefs personally. But as I said at the start, there's no hard evidence either way. I think the internet is playing a role, but it's definitely not straightforward. And I think with COVID-19, it's going to be interesting for computer scientists and those alike to kind of work through, for example, the Twitter and see the tweets, to see how people's discussions changed and how different conspiracy theories emerged. For example, how 5G and the link between COVID-19, how that emerged on social media and how that kind of filtered out. I think that will be really interesting to see as time moves on and people can actually look at these questions. But right now, internet, yeah, plays a role, just don't know how or why.
You mentioned earlier about you recently published a research. Could you talk us more about your research? What did it involve?
So my research has been very much focused on the consequences of conspiracy theories. So I'm really interested to understand the potential impact. And indeed, when I first started this research program, conspiracy theories were thought to just be harmless bits of fun. And when we kind of went into it, we thought we would just see, are there any consequences of believing in climate change conspiracy theories or anti-vaccine or believing in Jewish conspiracy theories? Are there really any real world consequences? And what I found throughout our research time and time again is that these beliefs can really affect how we see the world.
Mhm.
which I do think actually makes sense, whereby if you see the world as full of conspiracies, where you think the government is involved in X, Y, and Z, you are going to want to disengage because you don't want to be voting, for example, for a government that you do not trust. Instead, you're going to want to dry out and do other kind of mechanisms. So we've been really interested in asking those sort of questions, whereby we often do questionnaire-based research, where we give people questions and we see are their responses associated. So does someone who believe in a COVID-19 conspiracy theory, are they less likely to comply? To
Mhm.
see associations. But we're also interested to try and work out cause and effect. So does conspiracy theories actually lead you to not want to vaccinate or not want to engage in climate change behaviours or to maybe discriminate against someone who is Jewish? So we expose people to conspiracy theories. We take them from online, from websites, from blogs, things that actually exist in the real world that people could be exposed to. In a controlled environment, we have people read this information. And then we ask them questions to see how it impacts them. So, for example, we found that people who were exposed to the idea that Jewish people are conspiring are more likely to have negativity towards a Jewish person, which also leads them to be more discriminative towards them, to not want to vote for a Jewish political candidate. So being exposed to a conspiracy theory directly has an impact on how they see other people and how they engage in society. So using these methodologies, we can see the impact of conspiracy narratives.
Mhm. Earlier, you pointed out the importance of, I suppose, being selective with the sources of your information. Aside from that, how can we protect ourselves from conspiracy theories?
So interventions are a timely issue, but they're also a challenging issue. I think it's thinking about who we target. So talking about the general population, if we can instill critical thinking abilities where people can stop and think before they share. So for example, when they're exposed to something on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube and it has a big reaction in them, they're really, really angry or really happy, they can pause and stop and think, okay, do I trust this source? Is this source credible? What are other people saying? Turn the topic into a question and post it in Google or wherever you go and see what other trusted sources are saying. If everyone's saying the same thing, then it's likely to be credible. And by stopping and engaging in that critical thinking, in essence, it may stop you sharing that misinformation, where you're just sharing it because it makes sense to your prior beliefs. So that's kind of one way, is to try and instill these skill sets. Could be in schools or whatever it is. But then we've also got those who are at the hardened end of conspiracy theories, where they really are invested in their beliefs, where getting them to really engage in counter arguments, in essence, will be quite challenging, because if they're mistrusting of government, they're not going to trust what the government says. So there are some theories or some suggestions that a trusted messenger could be useful here, whereby it's someone who they trust could engage them in their beliefs, where they get them to really affirm the values based on critical thinking. Because whilst we know empirically those who engage in conspiracy theories are less likely to think critically, subjectively, they believe they're being critical thinkers. But in reality, they may be falling trap to confirmation bias, where they're staying in their echo chamber. So instead, if we can affirm the values and talk about how it's important to ask questions, to think about the source and what the person is saying, and then turn it back onto their belief and get them to think more critically about what they are believing, maybe that could start to change their beliefs and change their mind. So not coming at them with, here's the government advice, but kind of changing it to something that they can engage in. So we do know counter arguments work, and they work for the general population. Just for those who are really invested, it may take a bit more of a nuance to get through to them and change their minds.
So let's talk more about about sources of information. So let's say, as a researcher, would you say it's better to be selective of the source of information, or it's better to just, look for another source of information with offers a counter argument? So say, for instance, I'm not really a big fan of BBC. I cancelled a license fee. In fact, I asked my husband several times to cancel a license fee because I'm not really a big fan of BBC. I get my sources mainly from, I just quickly see the headline. Mainly I get my news from the Telegraph. So obviously, if as a reader of the Telegraph, you talk about echo chamber, because I'm culturally and politically conservative, it kind of like offers me a certain narrative, not just in politics, but in other issues as well. So would you suggest that to combat tendency for conspiracy theory, would you suggest that I go for other sources, or just...
That's a really good point. I think what you've talked about is, in essence, an echo chamber. And that's what we all do. I do it myself. You stay on Twitter, for example, in the followers that you follow. You don't necessarily engage in narratives that are different to what you believe in. But I think to be a real good critical thinker, where you're very skeptical, you engage in different sources and see what the other side is saying, so that you can get a full rounded picture of an issue. Because of course, as you say, every outlet will have its own bias. And if all these different outlets are saying the same thing about a particular issue, that really kind of adds credibility to that particular point. If they're all saying this is what the truth is, well, then that can be seen to be the truth. Whereas if you stay in your echo chamber, which, as I say, I'm a victim of doing it as well, you may only come in it with a certain viewpoint. So those who may be more likely to engage in conspiracy narratives, by engaging in just one side of the coin, they're not necessarily being critical of the whole narratives that we're all exposed to. But of course, by engaging in arguments that go against our beliefs can be challenging. And it obviously doesn't make us feel comfortable where we're reading things that we feel are wrong. So it's kind of it's a hard process to kind of engage with, I think. And that's probably why we often always just stay in the echo chambers. But I think even just being aware that that exists, and what echo chamber is, i.e. the bias and that potential is what we are exposed to, is a good thing, because we can then think more clearly about what we're being exposed to. Right? Okay, yes, I'm reading this in this newspaper, but I know there could also be other viewpoints on this, which may help conspiracy theories not be as sticky potentially. But it's hard. It's hard. There's no easy solution, unfortunately.
Now, of course, in your line of work, I'm quite confident that you've heard of David Icke. And of course, most recently, he has been banned on YouTube. What I'd really like to ask is, how do we balance freedom of speech? So firstly, do you agree that those who spout conspiracy theory should be banned?
It's a really good question, and something that I've been thinking about as well. It's a real tricky issue because, as I said at the second question, it's hard to define what a conspiracy theory is. And often people have very different viewpoints of what a conspiracy theory actually is. I think the policies based on Facebook and Twitter is that they remove content that is shown to be untrue and can actually have an impact in the real world. So inciting violence. And I can get on board with that. And instead, things that are debated or are maybe shown to be untrue but have no immediate threat, they either come with a warning that says that this information is maybe discredited or this information is being debated, so that people can then not be exposed to it, then being aware of it. They're kind of having that kind of pre-warning in essence. I think that's kind of a good move to go with, because we want to ensure people have a platform and a place to discuss conspiracy theories. In essence, to ask questions. Because when something happens or something new happens, people want to know what the cause is. And asking legitimate questions that are then explored by the relevant scientists or experts is a good thing. So when 5G first came up a few years ago, people asked questions about, is this safe? So I think those are legitimate questions. And Scientists then worked and they did tests and they worked out, that it is indeed safe. Same with climate change. Is it really happening? Scientists did experiments and the consensus was, yes, it is happening. It's not, it's human-made. It's not just a hoax. That then adds that credibility to, well, this is a truth and this is a conspiracy theory. But potentially, if there was no mechanism to ask the question initially, it then limits that free speech, as you say. It can also be an antidote to conspiracy narratives, because if people feel that they are being silenced, that can only reaffirm what they believe. So I do think that there needs to be a place for these theories or these questions to be asked, and then for scientists and experts in that field to then say, we're going to do tests on this, or this is shown to be false. Where things that are shown to be false then have the misinformation tag on it, and then things that are false and also are violent in nature are then removed. And I think the way Facebook and Twitter are dealing with it is probably a good way to go. But of course, it's not just the only way. I think by putting all the onus on the social media companies is a bit too much, where taking responsibility ourselves is also important. So going back to those skill sets, if people are able to think through information, that they're aware of how social media works, how things that are spread can be spread quite quickly, and it's important, if you have a reaction to it, you stop and you think. And that means that if things that are pushed out that are indeed just misinformation can be stopped, not just by the social media companies, but also by individuals, where they're not necessarily spreading it. So I think in the broad stream of things, I think conspiracy narratives and those alike do need to stay on social media. They do need to stay where we can discuss them. But there is a line. I think that line is when it becomes violent. So suggesting violence against phone mass, or to do with COVID-19, or to do with different communities. So suggesting that there should be violence towards, Muslims or Jewish people because of conspiracy theory, that's when it's problematic. But it's a challenge to get the balance right. And before COVID-19, these kind of tweets, Facebook posts remained, and there was no real emphasis on removing them. Whereas now there seems to be much more wider policies on how to deal with this kind of information, which I think is a good step. We just don't want to be in a place where conspiracy theories are banned, because that's just not going to work. That's just not going to work now or in the future. So it's trying to get a balance on these platforms that enables them to stay, but can also be refuted at the same time.
I actually, as a free speech absolutist, I definitely agree with your take that conspiracy theory should not really be banned on social media, like YouTube or Twitter, because what will happen is that, as you've just pointed out, if you silence people, it will actually trigger them more to talk about the conspiracy, and thereby enhancing their belief. And actually, that's true. I don't know if you've heard about Gab. Gab is actually an alternative for Twitter, and most of the people in Gab use that because they've been banned on Twitter. And the last time I checked, Gab has like 10 million visits a month, and that's really something. That's really something for a newly established platform. And the same thing with YouTube. There are a lot of videos that will be blocked on YouTube, like David Icke videos, or there's another scientist who thinks differently about coronavirus. You can't find that on YouTube, but you can find it in BitChute. And BitChute also has a good traffic. So that's the thing. If you're actually silencing people, they will end up creating their own platform. And that, in essence, it's a recipe for a new conspiracy theory. Sorry.
Conspiracy theories exist without the internet. They've existed to a high demand. 60% of people believe in the JFK conspiracy. So the internet is just one mechanism that people discuss conspiracy theories. So by removing that from the internet, it won't stop them. They'll always exist. But as you say, they may find other places on the internet. So to be a true skeptic, you ask questions, but then you evaluate the evidence. So that when the scientists come back after doing their experiments or whatever, and there's consensus that says climate change is indeed true, it's not a hoax, we take that on board. And potentially having the critical thinking abilities and understanding our biases may help with that. Because of course, people who believe in conspiracy theories, they ask the questions, but then when the scientist comes back and says, this is what we found, they don't trust it because of their worldview and the biases that we have. So if we're able to ask the question, but also to evaluate the evidence, I think we're in a really good place. So as I keep saying, a challenge, a timely issue, but a challenge nonetheless.
So, Dr. Jolley, what's the most important thing that you want the people to know about your work? You've been working on conspiracy theory, so what's the big message?
I think that conspiracy theories can have a significant impact on the self and wider society. Often conspiracy theories are thought just to be silly narratives that are believed by only the fringes in society, whereas these narratives can impact people on a daily basis in a whole range of different outcomes, from their medical choices to how they view other people to how they engage in work. It can have a wide-ranging impact. It can vary for each person, of course, but it still shows the narratives can impact us in a significant way. So I think that's something that we've shown time and time again. So whilst it's important to understand why people believe, i.e. normal everyday processes, it's also really thinking about the consequences of them engaging in that thought process. And indeed, that highlights the need for interventions, whereby if they were just interesting narratives that had no consequence, well, then they can just exist without us worrying about them. But because they do have a real-world consequence, it's important that we do engage in how we change people's thinking to ensure they can ask the questions and evaluate the evidence at the same time.
And is there a particular individual or book which has the greatest influence on your work?
I suppose it's going back to where I first started, Karen Douglas, because of course without her mentorship I wouldn't necessarily be here today talking about conspiracy narratives. So I think she's had a significant impact in the way I think and the way we kind of approach these issues. And I'm so fortunate enough to still work with Karen, even though I got a PhD many years ago, that we still work on different projects together. So I think very much Karen is kind of a big supporter of this.
And for the longest time that you've been working on conspiracy theory, I'm quite sure that you've heard some misconceptions about conspiracy theory. So what are those misconceptions, and it's your chance to address those misconceptions now?
There's definitely, at least there was, maybe there still is, that people who believe in conspiracy theories are just paranoid, who wear tinfoil hats. And indeed, lots of media articles often just put a picture of a man wearing a tinfoil hat as their cover picture, which paranoia is associated with conspiracy narratives. That is true. People who are paranoid can believe in conspiracy theories. But hopefully, as we've talked about for the last however long we talked, it's more nuanced than that. It's people trying to understand the world. It's everyday people asking questions about the world. So just to dismiss conspiracy theories as just paranoid, to other the conspiracy narratives or conspiracy theorists, to see them as irrational is a misconception. They are not irrational. Of course, they're based on false information, but people are engaging in thought processes that to them are rational, that we can understand, we can engage in. So I think there's that it's only paranoid people. And of course, as I've mentioned, that because only paranoid people believe in conspiracy theories, they're harmless. Because what harm could they have? But where millions of people believe in conspiracy theories for everyday reasons, this could actually impact me and you in a whole range of different ways. So I think that's kind of a little misconception that often is taught about, which is indeed a misconception.
And for those who would like to follow your path, can you recommend a good book to study the basics about conspiracy theory?
So there are some real kind of interesting books that have come out recently, actually.
Mhm.
There's one called Conspiracy Theories and the People Who Believe Them, which is very academic. And there's a whole range of different scholars who have talked about different findings in this area. But there's also a book called The Psychology of Conspiracy Theories, which is more of kind of a public-friendly kind of summary of what the research has shown to date. I've not been involved in any of those books, so there's no bias on my part. I just think they're really good. So I definitely recommend those two particularly.
Could you give me the title of the book again and the author, because I'll put down the description box.
Conspiracy Theories and the People Who Believe in Them, Joe Usinski. And then The Psychology of Conspiracy Theories, Jan William Pugin. But I can send the links to you if that's easier.
Okay, thank you. And I always ask this question to my guests. This is like my standard question. You can answer it within your line of work, or it could be something else, but I would prefer it to be something else. What's one thing about psychology that you think we don't talk enough about, but we should talk more about it?
I think the methodology. So being really clear in what the findings show. So what would that I mean? When we talk to the media and the press releases and newspaper articles, sometimes causation can be mixed up with correlation. Sometimes it's because the way it's been written in the press release. Sometimes the wording is a bit more sexier if it's seen to be causation. So having that understanding that correlation doesn't equal causation, and that where we talk about associations, they are just associated. That this variable is related to this variable. We're not sure what causes what. And then things that have been done in experimental paradigms, that we can see that exposure to X equals Y. Okay, we talk about it in that kind of terms where we know this leads to that. But sometimes we read about studies and findings that seem very kind of strong and this is what's happened, when in reality it's just correlational research. And having the kind of mindset to kind of stop and think about the language we use, because associated and leads to are just kind of nuances in language but can have very different meaning. And that's something that sometimes isn't always picked up in the media, because of course saying lead to is more exciting potentially than saying associated. So it's kind of policing ourselves to ensure that we're talking about our work in a way that is accessible and is true. So with my way I talk about my research, I try and be careful and talk about things that are just associated and things that I know are experimental. That kind of change in language, which I hope comes through. So I think that
actually, well, when you mentioned about making a sexier headline when you publish a press release, that kind of strikes a chord with me. Of course, it's not a secret for the viewers of this video that I actually run PsychReg, is a psychology website. And I publish a number of press releases. I also publish press release from VPS. And of course, because it's my website, I sometimes tweak the headline. And I kind of, I'm quite guilty of, because as a website owner, your main goal is to attract traffic. So you kind of tweak it so you could attract attention. But I am guilty of that, and I'm not a hypocrite. But I suppose you kind of made me realize that also because my background is in psychology, I should really balance between traffic and factual element of what I publish. But yeah, that's a good point. That's something that I've never had before. But thanks for reminding.
Oh, good. That's good. I'm glad to hear that.
So, Dr. Jolley, what's your distressing outlet? What's your other interest aside from psychology, aside from conspiracy theory?
I was going to say, I think travel is good. I think it's good. I quite enjoy traveling and seeing other places. And I think being academic kind of fits nicely with that, because you do get to travel. You get to go to conferences. Before COVID-19 broke out, I was meant to go to Brussels, then to Miami, meant to go to Poland, which all over the last couple of weeks have obviously all been cancelled, either because the conference has been cancelled or because the meeting's been cancelled, which means that I obviously haven't travelled. So that's something that I've realised actually over the last 9 weeks, I've not left my house much, but I've not left the UK. Whereas previously I was always seen to be doing different things, having really cool opportunities to go and see new places, get to talk about academic stuff, of course, but then also get to see different places that I would never have seen. So I think travel is something that I do enjoy doing, and going in the whole kind of rustle and bustle. Also, I am enjoying media engagement. So I've mentioned at the start that it's still kind of academic, I know, but I mentioned at the start that because of the COVID-19 kind of pandemic, and I've done research into the consequences of conspiracy theories, I do a lot of media stuff. So I've done more media over the last few weeks than I've done for my whole career. So different TV channels, different journalists, different publications. So it's quite interesting to talk about conspiracy theories in a very kind of different way. So it's not academic, it's more kind of everyday, trying to help people understand what is happening. So whilst that is related to work in a sense, it's not in the kind of remit of necessarily being academic, whereby it's not in my job description that I'm going to speak to the BBC, for example, or whoever you like, but that's kind of, I'm quite enjoying that kind of science communication. It's stressful, but it's fun.
And when you mentioned earlier that, being an academic, it involves a lot of traveling, that's not a conspiracy theory, is it? I'm only
joking. It is. Well,
I can vouch for that.
It depends how much you engage with it, but I certainly have a good opportunities, so like conferences and other kind of fun things you get to do. But of course, when you get to go to, let's say, Poland, to a conference, you then can stay for a few days and look around and kind of immerse yourself in the city. So it's not all just work.
Now, finally, Dr. Jolley, what's in the pipeline now? Where can we learn more about your work?
So I do have a website at danieljolly.co.uk, which I like to make sure I put updates, my papers, my media kind of engagement. I'm also active on Twitter at Dr. Daniel Jolley, and I try to kind of tweet about being academic in essence and kind of conspiracy related research, stuff that I do, others do. It's going to be that central hub for conspiracy psychology. You can learn more there. I have other projects happening to do with young people, to do with HIV, to do with feminists, to do with COVID still, interventions. So things are kind of bubbling away that are still kind of pushing this research agenda through.
I think you were also part of I'm a Scientist, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I'm a Scientist a year or so ago. So I'm a Scientist, of course, is where you engage with young people. So often it's secondary school students or sometimes primary school students who they can ask you questions about being a scientist, and person at the end of a 2-week period who's voted the favourite scientist in essence gets a prize. And I was lucky enough to be voted the favourite scientist. So I used my prize money to commission some artists to draw my research programme. So in cartoon format, which I then uploaded to YouTube as kind of a narrative video in essence. I've also printed out the cartoon as a postcard, which I give out in my talks. So it's kind of a good way for science communication. And it's been viewed, a reasonable, nice amount of times. You can find it, I'm sure, on my website. But it's a good way to kind of understand conspiracy theories in an accessible way. So in my future projects, I try and have videos associated. So one of the projects I had funded by the British Academy, I put some money in to have some video editors make a cartoon on the findings, which is not yet released because the paper is still under review, but once the paper's accepted, I will then release it all in one go. But yeah, trying to communicate in different ways, which has been inspired by I'm a Scientist, because the video seemed to work quite well.
The reason why I mentioned I'm a Scientist, because I was also part of it last year. I was a runner-up. I was not good enough for the students. It was a nice experience to engage with students. But anyway, I'll have another go next time.
It was really good. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Anyway, Dr. Jolley, it's been an insightful conversation with you, but unfortunately our time is up. But I'm really delighted to talk to you about conspiracy theory and the aspect of your work. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise, and I look forward to hearing more about your work.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.